Hello, my name is Daniel Kim, and I'm here to talk with you about systems thinking, specifically why systems thinking now more than ever. And as I thought about this topic, what came to my mind was the well known theory put forth by Adam Smith about the invisible hand, right? And here's what he wrote in the Wealth of Nations back in 1776. He proclaimed that the mystical principle of the invisible hand, that each individual in pursuing his own selfish good was led as if by an invisible hand to achieve the best good of all, so that any interference with free competition by government was almost certain to be injurious. So that theory, while it was meant for actually a pretty narrow application in his original writing, became quite popularized to, I think, explain more economic activity as a whole. And it seemed to have pretty good explanatory power. So that the argument for laissez-faire, free market capitalism was the answer to the way in which economies should be allowed to grow and develop. That works to an extent, and like all theories, it has sort of the areas in which it has great explanatory power and predictive power, and where it does not. And I think now more than ever, what is becoming clear and clear is that the invisible hand theory breaks down in a lot of situations. And one of the situations is when you begin to hit the resource limits of whatever activity you are engaged in. For instance, back in the 1800s, there was another economist who talked about the phenomenon that is referred to as the tragedy of the commons. And this is where every town in England and Ireland would have a common area in which all townspeople had free and equal access to. So if you're farmer A, you could take your livestock and graze in the commons and benefit from it yourself. And of course, the community would benefit to the extent that you then were able to sell your livestock and carry on trade. And farmers B, C, D, etc. would all do the same. So everyone pursuing their individual self-interest benefited, and the whole would benefit. Now, when the first farmer begins to notice that there's a bare spot in the commons where he goes to graze, what does he do? He wants to get his grazing in, so he comes early to get a better spot the next time, right? The next day. And so farmer C ends up with a bare spot. So what does farmer C do? He or she will also then try to come a little earlier to get a better spot. Nobody in that setup would think to stop and say, wait a minute, maybe we are destroying the commons, and what I really should do is not graze my livestock, because if I did that, I would lose the benefit, but the commons itself would not be saved. Because what would the other farmers do? They would just continue or graze more. And so it is a situation where the systemic structures are such that the incentive of every individual actor is to do more of the consuming, even if they're aware that their consumption is going to lead to the collapse or tragedy of the commons. So this is where individual agency left by itself does not produce the kind of net positive result that the invisible hand theory would suggest. The tragedy of the commons theory, if you will, says exactly the opposite. So the solution for a tragedy of the commons situation actually does not lie at the individual level. You can't ask and expect individuals to change their individual behavior to say what everyone can see is the tragedy in the making. Because if one refrains but others don't, they lose and everyone else gains a little more for the time being. It requires a system level solution where either a central body is given authority to manage the commons on the behalf of everyone, or you create some kind of a mechanism, a system in which the individual actions and decisions would be influenced by the mechanisms put in place so that it would self-regulate, but not as individuals making their choices, but the way it's structured. And of course, Singapore is full of good examples of that. I know as a systems thinker, when I first came to Singapore, I was delighted to see systems thinking in action. The ERP is a great example of that, right? Where if you allow, again, everyone to just pursue what they want to pursue, which is get to point A to point B as fast as they can, they will all want to use the expressways. The fastest means. And when one person does it, no problem. 2, 10, no problem. It gets to a point, though, when it reaches and exceeds the carrying capacity of the roads, then, of course, you get the usual traffic jams, which is what plagues every major city around the globe. So individuals left to their own devices, each trying to optimize for themselves, actually creates a tragedy for everyone, which is called gridlock, right? And the rush hour gridlock. So, and of course, one individual stopping their behavior doesn't change anything. They lose, everyone else continues, and the system will still end up being gridlocked. So the Singapore's government's right response was to create a system level policy and put in the road pricing so that it would factor in the individual choices and have it cost more, and that people would then make their own judgments about when to be on the roads, and that put that system level consequence into the pricing. Same with the COE, right? With the car ownership and use, is to do that so that individuals are still, quote, exercising agency in making a choice, but the system has put in and factored in the costs of that choice. In the US, that's was an issue with our national parks, where it's all free. So, of course, free and equal access, and then more and more people use it, and each individual, of course, would gain benefit, but the park as a whole began to suffer. And the system response, and it requires a system response rather than asking individuals to self-modulate, is to implement the similar kind of thing, which would be user fees, and to adjust it for wherever the peak seasons are, and that would help kind of even out the demand stream. So these are examples of how to address a situation when the invisible hand theory actually is no longer relevant because of the resource limits, and or the time delays between actions and the consequences that are being reaped. So in our current world set of global set of issues, of course, we have some major tragedy of the commons issues. The tragedy of the commons as the fish stocks, right, in our oceans, the overfishing, and how trying to get every individual country by themselves to self-regulate is not very effective, because the incentive for each individual actor is to get more while it's there, because if they do less, they lose, but the others who aren't doing stepping back are gaining, and of course are going to be depleting the stocks anyway. So it's going to require a policy and some kind of governance structure at a system level. Same goes for water pollution, the air pollution, and of course, climate change. And all of those issues, to the extent that we are grappling with and not able to move forward on them successfully, I believe has to do with the fact that individual actors / countries are not approaching it from a systemic perspective, and we really need to do that. So this larger or general principle is really the balance between individual agency versus systemic response or systemic policy. And it's not so much an either or, because you need to do both, right? You will have policies that are systemic within which people make individual decisions or choices. But if you don't have the systemic policy and people just make individual choices, then we are more likely to produce these kinds of tragedies, as in the tragedy of the commons. There's a systems axiom that I believe is an even more basic principle. And it says that if you optimize the parts of a system, you're guaranteed to suboptimize the larger system. And the corollary is that if you want to optimize the larger system, then you're guaranteed to suboptimize some part of the system some of the time. And sometimes it's a little hard for people to swallow, where you say, well, I'm here to optimize, and give my best. And the belief is that that's how you contribute to the organization or team that you're part of doing their best, right? Is you contribute your best. But from a systems perspective, we have to understand our interdependencies. And this is one of the dimensions that we need to pay attention to in regards to the need for systems thinking. The tighter the interdependency, the greater the need for systems thinking, as opposed to individual or parts thinking. And so if you take as a team, a sports team, how much can I individually optimize my own performance that contributes to the team performance, has to do with the degree of interdependency I have with my other teammates with respect to whatever that sport that I'm in. So if I look at a track and field team as a whole, right, each activity, each event, I can optimize my own performance. And by doing that, I optimize the team performance, because the team performance is determined by the sum of the individual events, but I don't have to worry about the interdependencies across them. So in that case, it's sort of like the invisible hand, everyone pursuing their own self-interest of that event seems to contribute to the larger global interest. But when there are tighter interdependencies, like the 4x100 relay in the track and field, the event itself, that each runner can't simply run as fast as they can the entire time, because they're going to go blow past their teammates, lose the baton, mess it up in a way that runs slower than if they were well synchronized. So this is where you have to pay attention to your interdependency as a whole member relative to the whole, which is the team. Then you compare that to other sports like soccer, where the interdependencies are quite tight and need to be in sync moment to moment, in which case any kind of optimization at the individual level is going to lead to the sub-optimization at the team level, i.e. you're not going to win, right? You may have great individual scoring as an individual, perhaps, or stats in terms of movement or progress or minutes of possession or whatever, but it won't necessarily translate into the optimal result for the team. So the link between the micro and the macro, which is going to be, I think, of greater and greater importance, how the micro actions of individuals is guided by a systems view of the macro. so that they are both working together to produce the best overall outcome. And that will require more systems thinking rather than just individualistic thinking or parts thinking or analytic thinking alone. We need to be more integrative in our thinking to do that. So it's really looking at the way the world is continuing to head, right? Is that the world is getting smaller. And I think the COVID-19 pandemic is showing us that, how fast that virus travels because it is getting smaller. We are able to go from point A to point B so much faster. Information travels so much faster. Trends travel so much faster. And what that means is that then we're much more tightly intercoupled. So the interdependency has grown so that individual actions will have systemic consequences. And this is why in the Singapore's case, the circuit breaker was necessary. In the U.S., what they call sheltering in place or lockdowns in Wuhan, right? Where the central governing body creates a policy for individual agents to then take action so that you get the better global outcome. Otherwise, if left to individuals, and this is where some of the protesters in the U.S. are clamoring, saying, we know how to make our own decisions. We don't need government to tell us to shelter in place. We can decide when to go to a restaurant or not, or how to be safe or not. While it certainly, yes, makes sense in terms of wanting individual freedom and choice, but this is a bit like the tragedy of the commons situation, where if individuals take those actions, it will lead to a undesirable and tragic global consequence as a community. And while most people seem to understand that, there's still, at least in the US, a significant minority that does not, and therefore I don't believe is thinking and acting from a systems thinking perspective. And if people do that in other areas and other issues like the issues around climate change and the fish stocks, I think we will be heading more towards a tragedy rather than sustainable solutions. And this isn't just for these larger macro global issues, of course. Within organizations, we have similar tragedy of the commons situations or sub-optimizing the whole system because of individual optimization at the unit level or division or department level, when we do not recognize that systems thinking becomes more and more important, if not mandatory, when you have increasing interdependency among the parts, when you have increasing social complexity, where the number of issues or the number of differing perspectives of the members within that community or unit grows more and more diverse, and the degree of dynamic complexity, which is the time delay between action and consequence. When those get longer and longer, it is harder for us to see the connection without applying more rigorously systems thinking. So I hope that gives you a sense for why systems thinking now more than ever is needed in the way we approach our work, but our lives in general, as well as, of course, as a global community, in order for us to create a better, more sustainable future.